Hello, welcome to CodeJoy chess tutorials or recaps. I just reached basically my all-time high in classical. I got rid of the question mark because I played some games, and I'm 2063 now. And this is the game that I played. And I was listening to the Matrix theme song during it. Club to Death, really great song. I had it on repeat, and I was so he goes with e4, and I play the Sicilian defense c5. And at the highest level, I go with the Sicilian just because that's what I know how to play, but it really does have some drawbacks. And I'm just not as well versed in the theory of like e4, e5 as black. As white, I can do it, but um, I'm pretty comfortable with the Sicilian, but you'll see it does have some drawbacks against high-rated players. So I do the quick Sicilian, which is hopping the knight right out instead of playing d6 right away. And then he does the open Sicilian, which is the best way to challenge the Sicilian, which is just to immediately play d4. And then when I take back with the knight. And now if I take the knight, his queen gets out. And there's no way to attack the queen. So instead, I open up my bishop. And then he's playing the Maroczy bind here. He has a bind on d5 square. So my pawn, if I ever play the e pawn, moving it at all, the d pawn becomes a weakness, a backward pawn, and it can't advance because he has such a good control over d5. So this is a good way to attack the Sicilian as white. And here I hop my other knight out. And then he hops his knight out. Very natural for him. And then here I have a decision. I can play e4 or e5, which attacks the knight with the pawn. And then he would probably take my knight, and then I take back. And then, like I said, I have this backward pawn. So that's not great. So I decide I have to castle. I can't castle. The reason this Sicilian is tough is because you can't castle queenside really because you've opened up the c file. So you got to castle kingside, which means this bishop has to get out of the way. But this pawn doesn't want to move because it's defending this pawn. And then so you end up with like a super defensive structure because I try to fianchetto it over here. And then he brings his bishop out defending his knight and just developing. And I try to castle kingside, but the problem is with the bishop here, I don't really want to play e4 because then my bishop would just be looking at its own pawn. Anyway, I'll get into it later. You'll see my setup. So now he plays bishop out here, getting ready to castle. And then I castle, so does he. And then here is where it's hard to be active in the Sicilian defense. Apparently, computer suggests when he brings his bishop out to here, play knight out to here, attacking the bishop, defended by your bishop. And then maybe you can rotate it back to e5. So that would be like the pro way to play it. But anyway, I just fianchetto, we both castle. Then I bring my bishop out from the back row to here because I'm not worried about blocking this pawn because it's defending my main weakness, which is the d pawn, because he's going to form a battery on the d file because he has a semi-open d file and his queen's already there. This is a bad move because the knight can just take it. If the knight takes it, then I would play pawn takes and my rook gets activated. However, it's kind of awkward and I'd be down. He would have the bishop here. So he should probably take this bishop here, but instead, and my plan was to hop knight to e5 and then try to win this pawn on c4 with combination of the bishop. But he doesn't take it, and then in this position, I didn't realize that he could take it when I moved it out there. I knew it was protected, but I didn't really calculate him taking it. And so here I decided to just move it back because I don't want to give his knight something to munch on. Now in this position, he plays the queen up, and he's threatening bishop h6 here, trading off my important dark squared bishop in front of my king. So I play rook to the side. That way, if he plays bishop h6, I can play bishop h8 and avoid the exchange and keep my bishop controlling my king's dark squares because the pawns are all in light squares. And a pawn on a light square doesn't control any dark squares. So you need this bishop to stay alive. So he has a beautiful position here, and you'll notice he has more space. I'm all on the first 3 ranks, and he's got 4. So now he brings his rook into the fray. Then I play this pointless move of a6, giving a weakness on b6. So if his knight goes, I mean, it does block knight b5, but if his knight goes to a4, then it can hop into b6, and my pawn on a7 is no longer there. So I've created a weakness. The queen controls this weakness, but he has a bishop controlling it, plus one of the knights can hop in there. And it's not like I can play b5 because he has like 2 knights and a bishop and a pawn. And then so I wouldn't be able to ever control this square really. So I've given him a way in. But I didn't know what else to do in this position, and I know that a6 is kind of theory for the Sicilian, so I'm like, oh, fuck it, I'll play it, so that he can't hop in there with the knight later. At least he has to go to a4 instead of b5. So here he prevents my knight from going to g4 and just kind of solidifies his center. So in this position, I bring my rook over to the semi-open c file, and we have both developed standard Sicilian game and open Sicilian game, I should say. And it's his turn, and he plays this. Now this move strengthens c5, which I was going to attack with knight e5, c4 I should say, but it doesn't protect this knight anymore. So now this bishop is looking at this knight. It's protected by a rook and a queen, but it could potentially be vulnerable later because I have queen a5 double attacking it. So it's an interesting move. Here I thought for a long time here, and I couldn't see any way forward for any of my pieces, anywhere for them to improve. So I decided to exchange, giving some room for my bishop. He takes back with the bishop. And now our bishops are looking at each other. If I move the knight, he can take my bishop. I don't really want that. And now in this position, I play the bishop out where the knight was. See, so I hop the knight out and then put the bishop there. That's why I did that exchange, is so I can have my bishop attacking his king long range for the rest of the game. And let's see what, I also took out his forward knight. So here he goes back. So I guess, yeah, he took it and then goes back, maybe threatening h6 again. In this position, it's difficult because, again, the queen-rook battery on d6 prevents me from moving the e-pawn. And because then he would just take the d-pawn. So what can I do here? I can't really expand on this side because he has the knight, the bishop, and the pawn protecting it. And I can't play h6 because he has 2 guns on that. So maybe knight back. Yeah, that's what I did. So knight back opens up my bishop on his knight. His knight is adequately defended, but I gotta let my bishop breathe, and my knight now is threatening to redeploy. And also, it's kind of comfortable back here because the pawn on E7 is just staying there and protecting my weakness. So the strength of this type of Sicilian dragon setup is there's actually no weakness, but there will be if I move the e pawn. So I'm kind of delaying that and trying to work around it. That's why I did that exchange. Got my bishop out of the way and got my knight here. So now he goes back, defending his king against any potential, mate threats down the line. And, not really sure the purpose of that move. Here I play queen a5 because I got to get active, and I mean, my queen's a useless defender of this pawn because it's already defended by a pawn. And now the queen hits the bishop, or hits the knight and the pawn. And it's threatening to swing over to h5 and then just pressure his king with a queen nearby. The queen needs some help, but my bishop is pointed in the right direction, and this other bishop could deploy to e5 and, check over there. So it's just a way to get my queen out. Here, he hops his knight in. Notice his pawn structure is beautiful. He's got 2 chains and a bishop pair, and he's fully developed and defending his king, and now he's got a knight up in my business. However, and the knight is threatening e7, which would check and rook me, but I do have a rook already defending that. But I have to make sure that rook stays there because that would be a devastating attack. So where's this knight going to go, and what do I do? See, if I kick the knight out with e6, it makes d6 permanently backward pawn, meaning no pawns can defend it, and it's going to fall because it can't advance, and it's a sitting duck. So I can't really kick this knight out even though it's in my grill. So I play queen a3. Not really sure what the point of queen a3 is, why I did that. I was planning on swinging it over here, but he blocked. When I brought the queen up, his knight move blocks my queen redeploying to the side, so I decided to put it up on a3, permanently pressuring a2, so if his queen moves, for example, I can take all his pawns. And I'm preventing his pawn from moving by being so close to it. Also, I know why. Because his queen is attacking my queen in this position, so I had to get out of that. I can either take the queen and let his rook come up and then double up there, which I didn't like, or I can avoid the exchange, go back to the start, or go further into territory. So my queen's out all by herself, causing some mayhem, and it's just what I had to do to get out of my web that I tangled myself in. Anyway, then he goes here, defending this pawn twice, and he has to be careful where he puts his rooks because my bishop is controlling every single dark square on this diagonal. So here I hop my knight over to f6, threatening to take his strong knight, and he hops over here. Like I said, that weakness I created, and he's attacking my rook. But my rook can slide to the side where the queen is, and then so he has to move his queen, and he goes over here, and now he has a nice battery with his bishop controlling his knight, and maybe he can play bishop d4 and try to exchange or prevent my bishop from controlling so many squares. Or maybe he's thinking of redeploying on g3 and attacking my king. So here I decide to hop the knight back to potentially take this knight out because it's kind of close to me. Then he hops back. And now here, I decide to finally attack it. Now the difference is, when he first hops in, first of all, my queen's hanging. But then, like, when it's here, I don't kick it because my rook is not there defending. See, my queen defends d6, but my rook doesn't. So when he attacks my rook, now my rook defends this. So now when we dance back and forth, now it's different because I'm attacking this. My knight is defending his knight advance in. And when I move my knight, I have now defended this square on d6 with the rook. And so I kind of got his knight out of the middle and my knight into the middle. Turns out he still has a slight advantage, kind of. But, yeah, I didn't feel like taking the knight and then letting his bishop attack my rook. So instead, I hop my knight out here. It has no prospects, but it's safe here and should be influential in the middle of the board. And his can kind of get stranded. All right, so now he doubles up. This is this terrifying position because my pawn on d6 is weak. It's defended twice, it's attacked twice. And the problem is he can play c5 and with the pawn, and then I can't take his pawn because he would take my rook, and then when rook takes, his rook takes again, and that's check. So both my rooks would be dead, and only one of his rooks would be dead if this pawn captures. So the threat is c5 here. And I knew that, but he didn't. He never really played it until it was too late. So I'm kind of panicking here. And play bishop back, defending this pawn. The problem is it still doesn't defend the pawn because if you push the pawn here, I still can't take it because of the same problem. So that really just adds an attacker to my weakest point, and it also cuts off the queen from defense. But he doesn't do it. Instead, he attacks my rook, which is a good move still because this also removes a defender from this pawn because I can't, I have to move the rook from the bishop's attack. And if I go up, the knight gets me. So both these squares are covered. So I have to give up my prized bishop to block this attack because my rook needs to stay defending this pawn. And you'll see how the whole position revolves around what I was planning it revolving around, which is this weakness. So he takes, I take, and then I'm not really sure why he did this. You don't really want the queen in the front of the gun because the one rook can defend a queen and two rooks if the queen's in front because the queen doesn't want to start off the exchanges. So here I just go back. Remember, I can't double up because of the knight. And here he plays a nothing move, king h1. Maybe he's thinking of expanding his pawns. Here I play a really good move, I think, g5. The purpose of g5 is to stop his pawn from attacking my knight and also to give my knight a square to retreat to on g6. Because the knight right now, if it got attacked, it doesn't want to go back here because then the queen can take on d6 because I would block my rook and I have nowhere else to go. So I create a square for my knight and prevent the pushing, prevent the kicking of it. Now he goes here attacking this. My plan was to play h6 here and just kind of protect this pawn, but I decide to instead play f6 because it also protects the pawn, but it gives my knight another square. And this time the knight can hop back and defend d6. Now he goes here. I was thinking maybe he's trying to sneak around or something. Maybe he's playing h4. I don't know, but I should hop the knight back now and defend this pawn. But instead, I play queen to here, which attacks his rook and his knight. And the purpose of this move is if he tries to get cute with his queen on queen g3 or play h4, as soon as the queen gets distracted, then I take the knight and the rook. Well, not the rook, because it's defended by the other rook. But if his queen goes to g3 right now, then I would take his knight. So I'm putting pressure on his knight, because my queen wasn't really doing anything here because it was attacking a pawn that was defended twice. So instead I switched to attacking the knight, preventing his queen from doing anything besides defending it. But here he should play c5, but he doesn't. Instead he plays this interesting idea. See the whole, right here, if he plays knight back, like I'm monitoring all the knight moves he can make. I can kill it wherever it goes, but if he goes to a4, I kill it with the bishop, and then when pawn takes, I take the pawn with the queen. So I would get the knight and the pawn for the bishop and have an attack on both pawns at the same time on a4. So that would be good for me, but now the rook is involved in that variation by putting it over here. But he is no longer double attacking here and threatening c5. So here I play knight f7, protecting my weakness on d6. And I'm just being defensive here. I'm trying to basically strand his knight because I managed to kick it without dropping my d-pawn, and I'm defending it 3 times. And now he hops over here. I could take it, but then he would take back, and it'd be an attack on my queen from the rook. And if I took the pawn, he would bring his rook down and take my b-pawn, because my bishop would be dead. So the b-pawn would fall, and his rook would be in, attacking laterally. I didn't want that, so I played king f8, trying to add another defender to my only weakness, d6. So the whole position, you'll see, revolves around white attacking on the d file and black trying to defend it. Now he brings his queen into here, protected by the knight, and my queen has basically no moves besides taking his queen. Turns out I could tuck it on a3, attacking his rook and potentially the pawn. But I didn't actually see that in the game, and it looked kind of depressing over there. So I decided to take his queen and let his knight be here. And now I play king e7. So I have 3 defenders on my weak point, d6. And he has 2 attackers. He doubles up the rooks again. And now, because my king has made a journey over here to defend d6, I have freed up my knight. So first I play h5 and just try to get a queenside pawn storm rolling, because I know I can move my rook over there and my knight over there, and my rook and king will defend this point. And also the king defends the rook on d8. So now if he plays c5, I would take the pawn, and when he takes the rook, I take the rook, and when he takes the rook, I take the rook with my king. So my king ends up saving the day by defending both the pawn and the rook. Now he gets his king back. I lash out because my bishop is biting this rock here, but by undermining its the pawn behind it, if he takes my pawn that I just pushed, then I would take his pawn with the bishop would be activated. So he plays his king up, and here I hop my. Now I've given, by playing these pawns up, I've given my knight a square to go to, and the knight doesn't want to be in front of the pawns; it likes being behind them. So now my knight is behind my pawns on the queen side, and it doesn't need to defend d6, so it's doing an attacking job right now. And the rook and the king are precariously placed where I can play knight takes pawn here if he takes my pawn. And so here he should play king up and defend this, or like move his rook. But instead he moves his bishop, and I'm like, okay, this is my chance. because now I can play the killer move. And that is bishop takes pawn. And now if he takes my bishop, which he does, I fork him. And if he doesn't take the bishop, if he tries to take this pawn, we both win some pawns, but the important thing is my bishop has come to life, and then also my knight has access to this square. So like if you were to take that pawn and I backed up, then my knight is threatening the forks just the same. And I just have a better position. So he takes my bishop, and then I check him, and then I take his rook. So I gave up a bishop and a rook for, I gave up a bishop and a knight for 2 pawns and a rook. So I got 7 and sacrificed 6. So that was a +1 for me. Now I have 2 rooks, and he only has 1, but he has a knight and a bishop. And I have some more pawns. I have all my pawns except for the 1 Sicilian pawn at the beginning. So here I start expanding because I have a pawn majority. I'm going to push through and try to make a queen on that side. He blocks me, and then I start to bring my king up because my king doesn't need to defend this because he only has 1 rook attacking it now. So my king is free to run up the board, and there's no queens on the board, so the king is not afraid to move. Now he plays his bishop back. I play my king up. I'm threatening to play the h pawn up and then just win these pawns kind of, or at least create a pass pawn. If I play h5 and he takes and I take, then this pawn on the f file becomes a pass pawn. All right, now he attacks my pawn, and I defend it. If I defend it with the d rook, he would take it with the knight. So I defend it with the e rook. And then he starts moving his pawns on the king side. Here I play h5, and with the idea of just getting my king, trying to move up as much as possible. He doesn't take, even though he probably should. And he tries to make something happen over here. If I take this pawn, he wins my rook. So here I push it up. Also, if you're wondering why I didn't play this pawn up ever, if I play the e pawn up, he gets his knight to a beautiful outpost on d5. So I have to leave this pawn here. So anyway, I play d5 myself. Now his knight cannot get into the game. All his moves to the center are blocked. And I'm also blocking his bishop's attack on my pawn, which means my rooks are free to do something else. So he lashes out with a4. And then I decide to, instead of taking his pawn and trying to bring my rooks over, I decide to just attack his bishop because now he has to make a choice. What diagonal do you want to stay on? You'll notice all my pawns are on light squares, just fighting against this bishop, so he can't get through. And he decides to go back here, but now his bishop is dead, kind of, because it can't get out at all without sacrificing itself, because I control all these squares. So that was a questionable move by him. Then I go over here, threatening f4, and if he takes, I would take back with the rook, protected by my king, and then come over here and win this b pawn. And I'm basically just trying to crash through over here because my king is close and I have more pawns. So I want to eventually narrow this down to like 1 pawn that I can queen. He goes over here, I take, and he takes back. And then I check him. And he takes, and I take with the rook. And now it's starting to look pretty good because I have more pawns and 2 rooks, and his knight's kind of stranded and his bishop's kind of stranded. But he attacks my rook and tries to get his knight back into the game, but I slide the rook to the side, attacking the knight and forking this pawn. But he goes over here saying, if you take my pawn, I'll take yours with an attack on you. But I decide to do it. Now, in this position, I could not do it, and I could play bishop to the back, or rook to the back, attacking the bishop, and the bishop is doomed because it's under attack, and it can't get out without sacrificing itself. So, but I thought if I play rook back here, he'll play pawn up here and attack my rook, and then I'll have to move it anyway. So I'll move the rook first, and then when he decides to play this pawn up instead of taking this right away. And here I decide he's going to win this pawn on b7. And it's going to come with an attack on my rook. So the rook's going to have to move this one. So I might as well use this rook to win the bishop instead of the other one. So then he does win that, but my rook's not under attack because I moved it already, and I win his bishop. And now he plays the knight out. And I thought the purpose of this knight move was to get out of the way of the pawn and promote the pawn. But the truth is, this knight is now threatening a fork on my king and rook. And all I have to do, because I won the bishop, the game's over basically. I have more pawns and I'm up in exchange. If I can stop his pawn from queening, the game is over. All I have to do is move the king to the side to get out of the fork and protect my e-pawn. But I didn't even see that, and I played the rook to stop him from queening because I was afraid of his rook playing over here and being behind the pawn, because once his rook is behind his pawn and it's marching, it's going to be really hard to stop. Turns out I could have just checkmated him before he got the queen if I brought the king over. But I try to stop this, blunder this, he checks me. It's awful because even though I'm close to the rook, his king is touching my rook, so he takes my rook with impunity, and I basically blew it. I had a huge winning advantage, and then I blew it right there by blundering my rook and not even getting a knight out of it. So I take his pawn, at least he can't queen, and then he takes my pawn with check, and I have to move back because his king is well placed. And now he has my king cut off. I have a one pawn advantage, but he has a knight. So if he can win this pawn with his knight, he might win the game. He checks me, goes back. He's trying to figure it out. I decide to attack his knight and pawn, x-ray, trying to win this pawn and queen. He attacks this pawn. I check him. I attack his rook. And then I check him again, defended by my pawn. Now he's back here, preventing any queens that I can make. However, he has boxed in his king. His king cannot move into the game anymore because my rook and pawn protect him or defend against that. The problem is my king can't get into the game because his rook is blocking me. So I attack his knight. He checks me. I move. And then he attacks my rook with this queen, blundering the knight because I have this pawn here so I can check. And then when the king moves, I win his knight. So it's interesting. The computer says that, like right here, it's zeros. It says it's a draw because of my extra pawn and his bad king position. It says it's a draw. Like this isn't a winning advantage for white. But when he blunders this knight, now I'm playing for a win because I have one more pawn than him. And then it's still kind of a draw though. But here this is a draw if he takes the rook and I take the rook. It would be 2 pawns against 1, but his king is back here, and I can't zuck swing it. It's actually a draw. But he doesn't call my bluff, and he hides. So then this little move by putting the rook here, it gives my king the opportunity to get into the game. Otherwise, it's a draw because my king can never make progress. So he misses his chance for the forced draw, and like he could have won by stalemate, or I mean tied by stalemate. Now it's still tricky. How am I going to win this? And then he tries to get his king involved. I check him, and then he decides to go to g3, and then that's checkmate. Because the pawn, he blundered that the rook is protected by the pawn, attacking him. My pawn is preventing him from going to the side. The rook prevents him from going backwards and attacks him where he is, and then the king prevents him from advancing. So he basically walks himself into checkmate. But I was up a pawn, putting pressure on him, putting pressure on the clock. And if you go back, so this is the final position, but if you go back to right when I win the bishop, right here, if I just stay calm and play the king to the side, it's -8 for black. So, like I'll show you. 56. See, it's -7. If I just defend this, there's nothing he can do, because if he tries to, let's say, queen, I think I would have this move. Yeah. And then I'm just up too much. But if I remember, I looked at the analysis, if he tries to play the rook here, preventing my rook from here, I have check. And then even though I can't stop him from queening, rook to here threatens a check on c4, which mates the king, because the knight's in his, well, because my king and rook and pawn and rook are just a checkmate pattern. So if he tries to go here, it would be checkmate. But anyway, I didn't play that. I played this. And then I just got lucky at the end and blundering a knight and walking into checkmate. But it was a 30-minute game. We spent a lot of time thinking, and I was up on the clock at the end, and he was making hasty decisions, and he lost. And now I am 2063. So hope you enjoyed. Thank you.